This guy is one of the greatest poets in the world, in my humble opinion. And I am very, very pleased and thrilled to introduce to you tonight the one, the only, Roger Craik!
John, thank you for having me here, and to all of you, and for an introduction which will bear no relationship whatsoever to what you're going to hear. I'm going to read probably about 6 or 7 poems to you. What links them is that I've never read any of them aloud before, and I'm consequently a little anxious about them. The first actually starts with the kind of comment you often hear in a bar, and that is of a disgruntled employee who thinks that this company will never fire him, and secondly, thinks that he's unappreciated at work and is therefore indispensable. That's the title of the poem. Indispensable. They'll find out what they're losing when I go, you said with rising bitterness, drawing on your cigarette. But I thought, no, the water's always closed, and someone else with his own vanities will come, replacing yours and all you are, as you did years ago, without a thought of someone dragging on a cigarette on his 3rd beer in some deep shadowed bar. When I was in Bulgaria, I was working in Sofia, as John mentioned, and I once got depressed and I sat looking at my desk and I started writing a poem about something completely trivial on my desk, which was a pencil sharpener, which is a curious thing when you think about it. I sent a clutch of poems to a friend of mine called Maxine Cumin, and she said, of all the poems you sent me, I like the one called Pencil Sharpener least. Nevertheless, it goes like this. Is this better for the volume? Pencil sharpener. On the glass-topped table, it sits like an exhibit, unlabeled, quaint before its time. A boy's toy sawmill with its blade screwed down aslant. A cruel surprise in a ridged blue shoebox, open as a dare. Close by my window on the 7th floor, the chestnut trees are leafing into bloom, tall white and red against the grain of Sofia, of Stalinist apartment blocks. And I am staring into them across the makeshift desk sparse furnishings, the shards of years grown inward, coloured pencils in a mug, a fountain pen, a malachite egg a grandfather bought over 30 years ago on a dusty summer jaunt somewhere near a race course. I am almost 52. The great sadnesses are not far off. I mourn what has not happened yet, and dully contemplate the sharpener, mute, absurd as a plastic Charybdis, eavesdropping on my thoughts. Stopping it, I turn the way that I was taught to wind a clock, an old-fashioned clock we had, and watch the act so long ignored or else become habitual, suddenly becoming magical. The scrape, the scratch, the bright grain forming straight from the blade and crisping out in curls until, with the sudden give my every nerve is drawn up, calibrating taut to stall, it breaks, tumbling like a paper crown that's come unclasped, its red line zigzag rim perfectly inscribed, the timber spelling out its tiny name to nothingness upon the air. And now from over 50 years, I seem to hear a woman's voice, tender, practical, distinct but faint. Here you are, dear, now the pencil's yours. You can write or draw anything you like with it. Some of us have trouble with microphones. I think I'll sing you something from Tosca while this is Tosca. That's not my line, that's George Bilgear's line. Tosca with a metallic edge. Is that better? Thank you. Here's another false start. Here's another false start. Is that better? Okay, this is a cosmopolitan poem for those of us who live east of Madison. Am I going to start this, or am I going to allow it to start?
Just go for it. I'll adjust on the fly.
Thank you. Thanks, Vertigo.
No problem.
Can I call you Vertigo?
Yeah.
Right. This is a cosmopolitan poem called Fish in Geneva State Park, Ohio. The barbed male with wide lugubrious head is poised, or somewhat poised from where I stand, 12 foot or so above, on the sunny bank. It's the first warm day of spring. Not so the female. She does move ahead, with muscular decisive seeming venturings upstream, or in a skirting semicircle to the left. But always she returns, resumes herself above, perhaps of my imagining, the fin-washed hollow in the sand. As on and on I stand, captivated, taking in the male's periodic, rigid shuddering, and once, just once, as if in secret ritual, the other tilting on her side, her every scale drawing down and deepening the sun, before returning it, a sudden gleam of bronze. This is a very casual poem, also written in Bulgaria, about the delight of being on one's own rather than being with other people. This is a comment I often return to. It's marvellous, by the way, being here in this gorgeous bar, to which I'll return. Thank you for having me here, John.
Our pleasure.
Sofia, early summer. Drinks, dinner, birthday cake are over, and you're in the street where the air's so balmy you could swim in it. You're even making unobtrusive, slightly swimming motions with your arms, while Tom, the amiable Irishman's persuading you and everyone to go to Jack's piano bar, even if it's only for half an hour. But when the others turn, your feet are walking you straight on, down Levski, where the choice is General Parentsov, where between the grim apartment blocks, or Yuri Venelin with the chestnut trees, white and red, between the grim apartment blocks. You stroll down Parentsov, it being nearer. At the corner you see tables, unstemmed, basic, unsteady looking, with no chairs, and on a whim you ask in Bulgarian for a beer, a Zagorka. You watch it, alive, its tiny bubbles rising, and it's beautiful, and yours, and suddenly the best drink you've had all evening, because it's you, just you on the corner of a street, alone with the night. My mother teaches English literature in a university in England. And when I was a child, she used to give me the finals papers to grade. That's to say, when I was about 10 years old, and I would grade all the finals papers with very strange accuracy on the basis of handwriting alone. And the poem's called Finals, but before I read it, I ought to explain that in England, your whole degree depends on 10 papers of 3 hours each, which are done in the last 2 weeks of the entire course. So you get people having nervous breakdowns and digging graves in their rooms and all sorts of other quirks, and it really is a harrowing experience. But this is a poem about different situations, and it follows a kind of meandering path with my mother and the speaker in it. Finals. Increasingly, the days grow precious burdensome. In her antiques graceful flat in Nottingham, once a maternity ward, where many whom I've met in middle age tell me they were born, my mother potters, smokes, watches television, dozing 5 years on, in England, in the curtained reaches of an evening, while her Guinness t-shirted son is proctoring the last exam of finals week. Invigilating was the term she used when she, austere, hair in a bun, would sit at a facing table at the front of some great dark armorial hall. Later on, ungrudgingly, she'd bend above a pile of scripts, a girl's large rounded characters, with little rings on eyes, delineating Hardy's Wessex, heath and furs. My mother rather cared for such as her, who simply liked the novels and the poetry, and some of Shakespeare's plays. Less so the spiky, critic-bristling manifesto paragraphs gouged out by the clever man, whom certain of her colleagues even lionized, impaling literature on Marx. The early summers come around again, another year has drawn to a close. Beyond the frowsty Roman corridors, beyond the institutional aluminium doors, dazzlingly spreads the college lawn, crowned with dandelions, and beyond, all Ohio's lawns, starling inquisitorial, and roads and rivers and lakes, and salamanders poised in ponds, lit by shaft of sun, their tiny hands distinct. And, further still, beyond all these, the crust of coast, the ocean and the seas, until at last are reached the older lands, the greater cities settled in themselves, the stone-strewn unmarked roads to villages where no bus turns. One by one, the plastic-coated chairs come desks are emptying, resume themselves as desks, until two alone are undispersed. I want to say, one word here or there will make no difference, and I hear my mother's Midlands cadence in the words unsaid. 40 minutes left. The air is growing thinner, short of breath. Urgently, before it gets too late, I want to tell my mother that I love her more than world away. I don't know if there's any word you like in the British language. A word that I like, although of course it doesn't relate to me, is the word philanderer. There used to be some while ago a radio show in Cleveland introduced by someone who described himself as a philanderer and poet. But that was long ago, and I think it makes no chime here. Anyway, the poem is about a philanderer lying in bed and imagining someone tampering with his email and sending messages from one thing to another thing. The poem's called Lying in Bed, and if you are of an ingenious frame of mind, you might want to get two meanings out of the title. Asleep, his mind in the machine switched off, he senses long antennae twitching like a cockroach's above his piles of messages, then narrowing from calipers to pincers, prying, rearranging here a phrase, a promise, a suggestive threat, selecting an address. Night sweats, the horrors. Shaken half awake, these he recognizes, these he knows, a vigorous splashing of the face dispels at once from palm-cupped hands. Not so, attendant at his tongue and lips, in his most suasive voice and cadences, the ready speech of expulcation scrolls to gloze all weaknesses as honesty, all lies in nuances of charm. He meant no harm. He never means to harm. His lips begin to twitch. A year or so ago, I had this strange and delightful and yet awful experience of listening to the best of Marvin Gaye, and it struck me how wonderful the best songs are and what drivel the bad ones are. And the poem is serious because this is actually about exploitation. It doesn't mention Marvin Gaye by name, but his name was what lay behind the poem when I was thinking about it. It's very short, it's called Best Of. They forced your voice to be a songster bird, to jingle gild their laid-down backing tracks into a string of soulless billboard hits, to make the shady men in raincoats rich, then left you broken where you started out, back on the other side of the tracks that you once sang about, so tender harsh, watching litter blowing down the street. The poem about fish I wanted to title Behaviour of Fish in Geneva State Park, but I really couldn't because a British poet called Keith Douglas had used a very similar title. Keith Douglas is the subject of this next poem, which is also very short. Douglas, as those of you who might know his work, was killed in the Second World War and writes with great understanding of the people he killed, and I joke not. But one of his poems involves a girl called Steffi, whose name is found on a love letter on a dead soldier's body, and it occurred to me that it was only by the girl who still lives reading Douglas's poem that she would know how the fiancé died. I hope you follow that, it's a touch convoluted. The poem hopes to make it simpler. War poet, died 1944. He knows the way a mother loves her son, his habits, mannerisms, how he moves, or how a sweetheart longs for her man, a German youth away in uniform. Meanwhile he sights his rifle, takes his aim. The gun makes ghosts of men. But what he wrote survived the war. We do not know the mother, but the girl is Steffi, living on in innocence until the soldier poet's finger curled. And I'll end on probably the simplest in subject of all, but perhaps the most, to me, enjoyable. Dogs in Boris's Gardens, Sofia. It's nosing day, and everybody's nosing there and here, but chiefly everywhere at whim. Even venerable stumpers, stiff and arthritic, straining after all their years, grinning sprightly, relishing, with card-like or with flapping ears, air and smells immenseness off the leash. Every minute's all day long, for charging in, for rolling on, for fetching sticks and frisks galore, for bicycling the air with all four paws. Oh, the happiness of dogs. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Roger.
You were great.
Roger Craik, let's give it up for him.